Psalm 140. 140.
Amazing.
When somebody in the presence asked Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach what his favorite holiday was, he replied, "Whatever holiday I'm observing is my favorite holiday." And I say that because as I prepared this morning Psalm 140, I am so taken by Psalm 140. I wouldn't say it's my favorite psalm, but in this moment it is. And here's what's amazing for me about Psalm 140. Psalm 140 is a familiar theme, and it's the theme of enemies. We're not told exactly who these enemies are, although this is part of this set of psalms identified with David. But here's what's interesting. The key focus is the use of the tongue, the use of the lips, the use of language that creates violence. Words can lead to violence is a key theme here in this psalm. But what's remarkable about this psalm is that although the focus of the psalm is on the power and danger of words, it is hard to follow the words. There are 5 different, here's the fancy term, hapax legomenon, 5 terms that are used in this psalm that are used nowhere else in Tanakh. 5 in 14 verses. There are 3 examples in this psalm of what the scribes amend the written text. That's separate from those 5. That's what's called Ketiv, as written, and Kri, as the Masoretes of the 8th to 10th century, as they kind of codified the Psalms. They, if you will, corrected their text to say, read it differently than it's written. And there are at least 2 verses, 9 and 10, that the translators like Robert Alter and Benjamin Siegel will asterisk and say Hebrew uncertain because of the grammar of how those sentences are put together. So to pull that together, what fascinates and delights me about the psalm is that it's a psalm about the dangers of language and uses language that's a bit elusive. And there's a couple more things. And what I'm drawn to in sharing is the artistry of these psalms. I tend to believe that these kinds of ambiguities are part of the message, that they're intentional rather than simply scribal error, which is how some modern scholars often fall back to explaining. And the other thing in terms of a message, which we've seen in other psalms, the image of the pits that they dig, may they fall into them, is a reoccurring theme in Psalms, which in Hebrew is called midah keneged midah, which means measure against measure. Whatever they sought to do, may it happen to them. What goes around comes around, as we colloquially say. And part of how that is represented in this psalm is there are 4 words: head, hunt, or the image of hunting, tongue, and lips, that occur early and late. But they occur early as to the danger of tongue and lips and the hunter, and then those same words are used at the end for what will trip up that harmful doer. And so the use here of language, of images, is what goes around comes around in a purposeful and subtle way. With that, even the title, I'm going to put it up and read Psalm 140, is a choice, because this is one of those hapax legomenons, namely in verse 4, the word achshuv, or chamat achshuv, both of those are kind of hapax, in that Chamat literally, or in other contexts, means anger of, but almost all the translations see this as the anger of an achshuv. There's a word that appears nowhere else in the Bible. Rashi will say that it's really akavish. An akavish is a spider, and that's how many of the classic translations are: the poison of a spider. Instead of the anger of a spider, the poison of a spider. But there are many translations, like the King James Version, that sees shuv as a repetition of nachash. Nachash is a snake, the first part of 4. And so this would be, in the King James, the adder's poison. Others would have it as the viper's venom. And so I chose this title both because it conveys for me that this is a psalm of choice of words that are rare, unusual, and is about the power and danger of language. That is what defines here the enemy. Now, it's a psalm for David, and we're not given a set moment in David's life. Classic commentators like Ibn Ezra will say that this was a David as a fugitive from Saul and those around Saul, like Doeg the Edomite and Achitophel, who are speaking ill of David to Saul, which gets Saul so angry he pursues the young David. But it's not clear by any means when this was written. And I point that out only to say the classic commentators do have this need to place a psalm identified with David in a historical context, which may not be the case. To structure, the word Yud He Vav He, the name we call on God usually in prayer, God's intimate name, occurs in this psalm 7 times. And again, that too is purposeful, as we know for the Bible, numerology, symbols of numbers, and 7 as completion is very important. The structure of the psalm is as a series of prayers, short prayers, verses 2 to 4, 5 to 6, 7 to 9, 10 to 12, a series of prayers. And then verses 13 and 14, the concluding, are kind of a reflection on the nature of God as the caregiver for the righteous, for those who are lowly and needy. And clearly this poet, probably a Levite, sees himself, counts himself among those lowly and needed. Psalm 140, poison of a spider beneath their lips. For the conductor, Psalm of David, Chaltseni, free me, Adonai, from a mortal of harm, from a person of violence protect me, who thinks of harms in heart, each day provoking wars. They have sharpened their tongue like a serpent, poison of a spider beneath their lips. Selah. Guard me, Adonai, from the hands of an evil person, from a human of violence protect me, who thinks to trip up my steps. The arrogant have hid a trap for me, and with cords they have spread a net. By the roundabout, ma'agal, snares they have set for me. Selah. I said to Adonai, my God, are you? Give ear, Adonai, to the voice of my pleas for grace. Adonai, my supreme strength of my deliverance, who has covered my head on the day of weaponry. Do not grant, Adonai, the desires of the wicked, his evil device. Do not advance, lest they exalt themselves. Selah. Head of those who surround me, Let mischief of their lips envelop them. Let fall upon them coals of fire, casting them into deep pits, never to rise. May a person of tongue never gain sanctuary in the land. The harm of a person of violence, may it hunt them down into the ditches. I know that Adonai will administer law for the lowly, justice for the needy. Surely the righteous will give thanks to your name. The upright will dwell with your face. This psalm ends with the words, your face, which again, the psalms are often composed and were presented at the Temple Mount by the Levites. And I can't help but gain an association to the closing word, panecha, your face, to the daily priestly blessings. Yivarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, may God watch over you and guard you. Ye'er panav elecha v'chunecha, may God turn God's face to you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom, where the word panav gets repeated twice. May God lift up God's face to you and grant you peace. And here the closing lines, verses 13 and 14, that deal with the tzaddikim, evoke with the last word, panecha, God's blessing. So that for those who are described here, the harmful, they will fall into their own harm. But the tzaddikim, those who are righteous, those who are the pilgrims, those, God's face. And back to the closing word, panecha, often it's translated, will dwell before your presence. But I like the image of face because there's a quality of immediacy, a quality of physicality. And this psalm is so physical, body parts. So we start from the beginning. And again, what fascinates me in the sharing is in taking a psalm as a unit, as a poem, is its purposeful artistry. For the conductor, and here too, for the conductor, Lemenatseach, is the sense that these psalms, and we'll see it on Thursday with Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, when they said, sing to us a song from Zion, is to say, what seems to be suggested is that psalms were sung. And here, psalms had conductors, Mizmor, a psalm or a hymn of David. Chaltseini Adonai, and that's the key theme. The word chaltseini, again, an obscure word. I thought of the word chalutz. It's the same root, the pioneer to Israel, which is why I chose among the various translations, free me, because I identify the chalutz with those who felt freed to reclaim the land. Chaltseini, also translated by Adin Steinsaltz, and I want to return to Adin Steinsaltz toward the end, translates it as rescue me, or the Art Scroll, release me. And that too is the nature of the translations, is that there are choices from the Hebrew. Free me, Adonai, from a mortal of harm. And here there are several different words used for people. Adam, I translate as mortal, because it's like Adam in the Garden of Eden, who's identified with eating the forbidden fruit and being told he's going to die. The quality of emphasizing in the first choice of these words that those who are in contrast to God, who are endangering me, are mortals. They are fleeting. From a mortal of harm, Ra, also translated by others as evil. Me'ish chamasim tinitzreini, from a person of violence, protect me. And that's the one phrase, to be, that will get repeated. And it'll be repeated in the middle of verse 5. In that sense, it's a refrain. And here a different word, ish. Ish is a person. from a person, Hamas. You know, that's the word used in the Noah story when God decides he's going to destroy the world because of it was Malay Hamas. It was filled with violence. And that too, the word Hamas alludes to that story of the corruption of the world. And there are echoes all throughout because, again, the audience that would hear these poems knew the sounds and the words of the Bible. And so God needed or chose to destroy the world because of Hamas, unfettered violence. Tinitz Reini, protect me. And again, Hamas has this quality of unfettered violence. Malbim, an important commentator of Eastern Europe, will make a distinction, and you'll see it in 2 and 3. The Malbim, who formal name Meir Leibush ben Yechiel Michiel Visser, who lived and died in the Ukraine 1809 to 1879, will say a mortal of harm and then a person of violence. He'll say those are two different kinds of people that is paralleled in 3 to who thinks of harms in the heart and then who provokes wars. So A, if you will, is the person who does it secretly. That's a mortal who is engaging in harm only for personal gain and therefore does it secretly. And that's very different from another kind of person, and that is the one who is public. You know, person of violence, provoking wars, and they do it because, according to Malbim, out of the self-satisfaction of power. It's not about personal gain, it's about public display of power. You have to get to the 19th century to have that distinction made, but I like it. All right, verse now 4. They have sharpened their tongue like a serpent, poison of a spider beneath their lips. And it's not clear when it says provoking wars, but if you take 3 and 4 together, the danger here is the danger of the tongue. And I mentioned that what this person does, right, by the use of their tongue and with poison of their lips, here, look how in verse 10, you're going to get those same words. You're going to get lips reappearing in verse 10, and you'll get also lips reappearing you'll get lips in verse 10, and you'll get tongue. I have to find the second tongue. But here, let mischief of their lips envelop them. Meaning, may it go around, come around. They sought to harm with their lips. May their lips harm, bounce back, and surround them, cause their own harm. Back to 4. Once again, 2 to 4 is prayer 1. Selah. I clap my hands, because Nachum Sarna says it's probably a musical notation, and it's to mark an end. He saw it as related to the word sal, basket, as if there's one of the musicians is the percussionist who goes to mark, this is the end of prayer 1, verses 2 to 4. And now the next Selah will be in 6. So here's our next prayer. Guard me, Adonai, from the hands of an evil person, from a human of violence protect me. That's that refrain. Who thinks to trip up my steps. And there's again the image now in 5 and 6 that will continue about what the person looks to do with their words is create traps. The language of animal hunting, which means that they treat others as animals, as objects that they seek to capture, to control. Verse 6, Tamnu ge'im, the arrogant have hid a trap for me, and with cords they have spread a net. So that's again how you would set a trap for an animal. By the roundabout, snares they have set for me. And now an original commentary based on this translation of Ma'agal and linking it to Psalm 23. In Psalm 23, we get the word Ma'agal. It's often translated as paths. In fact, King James Version in Psalm 23 is, God leads me by the straight paths. But indeed, the word Ma'agal has as its root, as Rashi and Radak, two of the classic commentators know, the image of circuit, of Ma'agal is a circle. And what I like is an insight that Sharon Green shared when I was sharing early. I had a lot less experience in Psalm 23 than I have at Psalm 140. And she said, as I shared that King James and many translations translate Ma'agal as straight paths, but I said, but the root is a circle. And there in verse 23, it's Ma'agle Tzedek, which we translated as the roundabouts of justice, which was to say, God leads me by the roundabouts of justice. And Sharon's insight was that she liked roundabouts because if you're in a traffic circle, a roundabout, you have to make choices. And it's the choices that link us to justice. Justice is not slam dunk. Justice is about weighing variables and making tough decisions. And that's evoked by the roundabout. And here's where I apply it to verse 6. Now, again, this is somebody who sees himself or wishes to convey to an audience that he wishes to elevate as tzaddikim, those who do what is right, and say precisely at those points of decision-making of righteousness, snares they have set for me. That's where they put the traps, those verbal traps, to trip us up. That verse 5, lidchot pa'amai, to trip us up so that we don't know how to make the choice of righteousness. I think of all those people who say, no news is to be trusted, all is fake news. Well, that's not right. I gained an insight recently that somebody said to me, I'll only read those newspapers that have corrections in them. If a newspaper has corrections, well, that means they're taking truth, or at least their attempts to be straight, seriously. And that's different to those who never have corrections. And that's a distinction between news and fake news. So this is too a prayer about guarding from the hands of those who would engage in violence by spreading traps with their arrogance. And then again, at the end of verse 6, an end, Selah. The next prayer, verses 7 to 9. I have said to Adonai, and here, by the way, I put verse 7 in quotation marks. I have seen in translations only the first half of the sentence put in quotation marks. Others will keep the quotation marks potentially all the way to verse 12. And that's the question, is verses 7 to 9. But 9, you'll see at the third Selah. So I tend to see the quotation as setting up the prayer of verses 8 and 9. I said to Adonai, my God are you, give ear, Adonai, to the voice of my pleas for grace, which I choose to translate as tachonunai, as pleas for grace, sometimes supplication, but the center of the word is chen, and grace is giving without expecting anything in return. And it's an image used for God, that God is the God of chen, of graciousness. Here the psalmist says, even if I am unworthy of being listened to, I know you will listen to me as an act of kindness, an act of grace. And so that's a bridge. Though I will add that at the very center of this psalm, and I always look for that as the bullseye, is the blank between verses 7 and 8. That is the actual middle and counting of words in this psalm. It's just to say that that's where the break occurs. as if verse 7 is both a conclusion of what's come before, although it was also the introduction to this next prayer. I said to Adonai, my God are you, give ear. Adonai, to the voice of my pleas for grace. And now the prayer. Adonai, my supreme strength of my deliverance, who has covered my head on the day of weaponry, an image of God giving, Radak will say, a steel helmet. And you can think of medieval knights with their helmets. Covered my head on the day of weaponry. B'yom Nashek. Do not grant, Adonai, the desires of the wicked. His evil device do not advance, lest they exalt themselves. One other poetic device that you see here, and it's repeated throughout the psalm, and that's the shifting between the singular and the plural. So do not grant, Adonai, the desires of the wicked, that's singular, his evil device, do not advance, lest they exalt themselves. And so that's again a poetic device to say that it's interchangeable at some point between the individual leader and the followers that do the bidding, that engage in this evil. And you'll find it here, head of those who surround me, maybe a reference to that leader. Let mischief of their lips, now shifting to the plural, envelop them. Let fall, and now the next section, the next little section, verses 10 to 12, another prayer. Let fall upon them coals of fire, casting them into deep pits, never to rise. There is being evoked the punishment of Sodom with the fire and brimstone. And the rabbis will say that the misuse of the tongue, back to that spider, that is a quality of a burning sensation when stung. It is like fire burning that they will fall into the deep pits, and back to the traps that they set, those animal-like traps, the snares. Now they're going to fall into Bal Yakumu, never to rise. And now the closing plea, may a person of tongue, that's the key theme, never gain sanctuary in the land. And the word yikon, I translate it as sanctuary, some will translate as never become established, but I like the play on words in terms of it sounds like mishkan, the sanctuary. May they have no sanctuary. The harm of a person of violence, may it hunt them down into the ditches. And here again, these words that appear nowhere else in the Bible, the last word of verse 12, the word b'mahamarot in verse 11, in which we surmise, and I choose the word ditches to play on pits, on those traps, the full circle. And now the close, verses 13 and 14. Here, again, I point out what is called Ketiv and Kri. Verse 10, verse 11, and verse 13 have a word and then a word in parentheses. The word without the vowels, that's called the Ketiv, the written. And then the scribe will add in verse 13 another letter and different punctuation. So Radak will say regarding verse 13 that the Ketiv, the written, is Yadata. You know, Adonai. And that rather than saying you know, the scribe guided and became normative to read I know. I know that you know is how Radak will explain it. Again, the scribes are, 8th to 10th century. Radak is later, 13th century, 11th, 12th century, 1160 to 1235 in France. Will say that this is another play. The closing meditation. I know that Adonai will administer law for the lowly, justice for the needy, Surely the righteous will give thanks to your name. The upright will dwell with your face. Those who use their tongue, that tongue leads to violence. They use their tongue, now I'm summarizing, in ways that are, if you will, simultaneously like a sword, simultaneously like the venom, the poison of a spider or a snake. But those words are elusive. The phrases are hard to figure out at times, and they're ultimately a trap that they will fall into. We know that words can lead to violence, and that violence will ultimately, the trap that they set will be their own undoing. But you who are here before me, the Levites, you who are the lowly, the needy, which also gets translated, again, I'm fascinated, ani, Steinsaltz will translate it as the poor. I think of lechem oni, the bread of affliction, same word here in verse 13. Evyonim, the needy, Steinsaltz will translate it. Or ArtScroll, the destitute. That the poet, as we have seen, identifies God is up on high, paying attention to those who are the lowest on the earth, those who are tzaddikim. And the other way this poem is read throughout Jewish history is as a declaration that foreshadows the future, in which David with prophecy will describe the pangs of the Messiah, that there will be the battles of Gog and Magog, Sforno will teach, but that God will administer justice against those who made our lives miserable in exile. And so 140 for some harkens to David, to others it foretells a future. And as I read it, I am again grounded in bringing to mind those who use words politically or religiously or socially in ways that are hurtful and harmful, and will, at least here, with a longer trajectory, hopefully, trip themselves up and fall into their own traps that they've set with their words. With that, I now shift, and I want to share one reflection in terms of bringing Sharon Green to mind, Sharon Green Schneider, in terms of, in part, Sharon, your image of roundabouts, which for me enhances this rare choice of words here, where the other, again, 2 times it's used. It's used in Leviticus 19. Lo tisna et verse 17, in which the roundabouts are used there for being in pain and confused. But in Psalm 23, here, verse 17:5, Tamech asherai b'maglotecha kol nabute pa'ami. Verse 17:5, as translated in the Mitsudah, let my steps hold fast to your path so that my feet do not slip. So ma'agle, translated as paths, is also better understood as roundabouts. It's a place of danger. I once had the privilege to set up an appointment with Adin Steinsaltz, the great, I've quoted him today in terms of his translation that I often make reference to Psalms. Adin Steinsaltz was the great translator of the Talmud. When he completed the translation of the Talmud into Hebrew, Time magazine did a big story on him, calling him a scholar of a millennia, equating him with Rashi of the 11th century. And I was in Israel on Saturday evenings. I would do a closing prayer for the end of Shabbat on the street. It was actually in a courtyard in the German colony. And Adin Steinsaltz lived in the neighborhood, and he was often part of that circle of participants. So at the end of a Shabbat, as we were leaving, I said to him, I would like to have an appointment to talk to you. And he said, I'm pretty busy. I don't tend to make appointments. And I said, but I really do. I want to talk to you. He said, look me up in the phone book. So I called and called the phone book. Indeed, Adin Steinsaltz in Jerusalem had his phone number. This is now about a dozen years ago in the phone book. And one day his wife finally picked up the phone. And she said, you don't want to call here. You want to call his institute where you can reach him. So I called the institute. And the only thing I could gain from the institute is, which I didn't know, he had these classes that he would teach one night a week on Thursday nights on the teachings of the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, a mystical text. So I went, and I got there early. And again, it wasn't widely publicized that there were these opportunities, and there was only about 6 students or 7 students. But before class began, I saw that he was there. I said, could I meet with you now? And he said, okay, come on in. And Adin Steinsaltz was a short little man who had this giant contribution to Jewish scholarship. He grew up on a non-religious kibbutz, and at the age of 17 would begin to develop an interest in religion and go on to become this larger-than-life teacher who, maybe in part because he had a secular background, had a curiosity, and his great contribution in his translation of the Talmud is bringing in realia, pictures of the objects in a historical context. So I sat down with him, and he said to me, my name is Adin, which means delicate. And indeed, I'm pretty shy, which is why, frankly, I'm not big on making appointments. I'm a little bit shy. A lot of people are scared of me, but the truth is, I'm Adin. And he said to me, what do you do? And I said, I'm a conservative rabbi in America. And then he said, I want to share with you something I learned from a conservative rabbi in America. I went to this conservative synagogue in New Jersey, and what this rabbi did is he went to people in the congregation who had an expertise in the larger world and had them do the Devar Torah, the teaching, but starting with their respective expertise. And he said, I thought that was beautiful. The ability to take something that they were expert in and apply it to the text. That's what you should do when you go back to your synagogue. And so Adin Steinsaltz and that teaching came to mind as you, Sharon, shared that when we got to this image of ma'agal, roundabouts of justice. And for me, it was an important word in Psalm 23, precisely because the image there in Psalm 23 of roundabouts of justice is the transition point from the God who is the shepherd, who leads me by, to the waters and takes care of me, I'm the sheep, to the shifting of being an adult who's responsible. And the notion, the transition point is ma'aglei tzedek. The notion that there are decision points that you have to step forward for the purpose of being a tzaddik, one who is righteous. That's the word tzaddikim that's in the closing verse of Psalm 140. Remember, surely the righteous will give thanks to your name. Those who are able to navigate the roundabouts. And precisely because, Sharon, you are a transportation planner, a designer of roads, when you shared your reflective insight that a roundabout is suggestive of choices, that it's not the straight path, the way King James and others widely translated, and here too, but rather it's that point of decision that determines whether one is a tzaddik or not. I just thought, wow, that's a key to understanding adulthood, a key to understanding what it means to be a tzaddik. It's not who follows the straight and narrow. It's one who has the ability to discern the traps, the verbal traps, the moral traps, and make decisions that lead you toward God, toward righteousness, toward tzedek tirdof. That famous line, righteousness, righteousness you shall pursue. The rabbis emphasize in that Leviticus 19:18 that the word is pursue, which is you never get there. It's not righteousness you shall be, it's you shall pursue. It's the, image in calculus of the line that never hits the base. It's a direction rather than an arrival. And so with that, Sharon, if you're there, I invite you as the honoree if you'd like to say anything about Psalm 140 or about roundabouts.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm honored with this honorarium. This is certainly very, very different in tone from the other Psalms, and it is such a violent Psalm. It is just funny that the word is used only in these three places. But I think the notion of choice, it's almost like you can't, it's not up to the individual to choose the right path here to avoid violence, because if it's set at all possible places along that roundabout, you really need God to protect here. It's just a very interesting thing about paths and choices. And I am struck with the term. It's not a term in English. So it's very meaningful to me. But I have to laugh because when you...
The last part, we have you laughing and then your voice dropped. Whoops, did I drop? Sharon, I think you dropped once you said, I have something to laugh. At least I couldn't hear it. Are you still there, Sharon? So, Sharon, I don't hear you. I hope you can hear me. Yes, can you hear me? Okay, thanks, Harris. So here, Sharon, I want to highlight your insight. Namely, Benjamin Siegel, who's such an important teacher, who I hope to do a closing conversation with. He's a rabbi in Jerusalem who was the head of the conservative seminary, who wrote this fantastic commentary to Psalms. What he will say is just what you put your finger on, Sharon, which is the paradox. Namely, this psalm, he writes, is a bifurcation of good and bad with no expectation of change on the part of the evildoers. And the contrast is the evildoers seem stuck in their way, while the righteous have choices. And that, of course, leads me to the image of Maimonides' teaching about when it says of Pharaoh that he hardened his heart. Maimonides will point out that that phrase appears 20 times relating to Pharaoh. First 10 are Pharaoh hardening his own heart, and then the second set is God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And Maimonides will say that habit of changing his mind, of becoming callous, created a reflex and already prevented Pharaoh from having a choice. And in that sense, his failure to have choices was both a punishment but also a natural outcome of habit. And so here, to pull together this psalm, it at first appears that the evildoers here are bent on their way. They have no choice. In contrast to the righteous, who are aware of the ma'agal, who are aware that there are choices to be made, and can make choices wisely with the wisdom that God represents and provides.